Hello and welcome to Europe in an Italian Minute. Today we're going to return to a theme we've talked about in the past, and that is the question of migration and the flow of refugees and refugee claimants that are arriving on Italian shores, on Greek shores, and on the southern flank of the European Union. Now, we've heard all about the numbers, and we all know the tragic stories and the tragic reasons that are behind what is, it seems to be an inarrestable wave that is arriving on European shores. But let's keep things in perspective compared to, say, the Bosnian crisis of the 1990s, compared to even Albanian refugees arriving in Italy in the 1990s. The numbers aren't all that staggering. But there are a number of issues that really in the recent events that highlight a lot of things about European integration and touch into a lot of fears about European integration, and particularly in Italy. Now, one of the elements of this crisis is that it is a multi-level issue. There's the broad international reasons that's pushing people across the Mediterranean, and they're coming for different reasons. The Syrian crisis is different from, say, people who are coming from sub-Saharan Africa and arriving through different routes. So there's that international dimension, and the European Union has tried to find an international solution at the level of the UN, and we know that Commissioner Mogherini has had a limited success. There's the European dimension of the problem, and that is the fact that when people are arriving in Spain and in Italy and in Greece and in Malta because they're really trying to get somewhere else in the European Union. And there we find the different levels of the problem. The countries that are destinations, Sweden, Germany, Austria, seem to be doing heroic efforts to accommodate large numbers, and the statistics tell us that they're accommodating large numbers. Then there's other countries in the European Union which aren't a destination at all, the Baltic states, Poland, and so on. So for them, there isn't necessarily a crisis. Then there's the Italian level of the crisis. What does the Italian state do in terms of mobilizing resources, both to find international efforts to deal with migrants coming across, then to what to do with migrants once they arrive? And then there's the local dimension of the crisis, and this is perhaps something that we don't see as much. But local communities all along the Italian southern coast, we all hear about Lampedusa, but all along the southern Italian coast, have taken in tens of thousands, and if we go over the last few years, into the hundreds of thousands of migrants who have come through. Some have stayed, many have stayed. These local communities have had to mobilize resources through NGOs, through local resources, and so on, to house, to feed, and to somehow accommodate large numbers of people that, quite frankly, they weren't equipped to deal with. So we have different levels of the problem that don't necessarily speak to each other and are trying to deal with different sets of issues. Now, this is where we get into what might be the political ramifications of the wave of migration. The biggest issue, and perhaps one of the underlying fears that people have, is that this is something that's out of control. And media reports seem to feed into this, and there's political movements that get a great deal of mileage out of presenting this as something that's out of control. Nobody seems to have an idea what to do. Nobody seems to have a plan, a strategy. Everybody seems immobilized and unable to respond to the different levels of the crisis, except perhaps at the local level, where we find what are really heroic efforts by private citizens, NGOs, even local governments. There's lots of room for criticism, but this is one area where we do see public action being effective. But at every other level, there doesn't seem to be a plan. And this has lots of consequences, because Europe, and the whole point of the European Union, go right back to the 1950s, was, well, national states can't solve the big problems of the transborder problems. That's why we need the European Union. And the European Union has a transborder problem here, and it doesn't seem to have a plan. At least that's what is the popular sentiment, except, of course, at the repressive end. If you get on a train here in Trento or in Bolzano going north to Munich and to Innsbruck, you get on a train and you find Austrian and sometimes even German police and border guards getting on. So those trans-border issues don't seem to be a question when it comes to trans-border police cooperation. But there doesn't seem to be a plan in terms of either finding a solution with respect to the source of migration, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of plan in terms of what to do when the migrants arrive on European territory. Now, the Italian government continues to put out the line that we are alone. Now, that is probably a very effective one-line description of the problem, but long-term, that really has serious consequences for support for Europe and European integration. Because if we are alone, then that means there isn't a Europe. And that's not a very long-term political strategy that is going to help European integration, and it's not going to help those political parties in Italy and elsewhere in Europe that are trying to generate consensus for European integration in a whole range of other issues. So yesterday, the Italian, this week, the Italian Minister for Internal Affairs, Alfano, said, we need to find a solution to make sure that people don't think that Europe is bankrupt. Well, Europe isn't bankrupt, but it needs to find a solution, and it needs to find a solution quickly at all of these different levels. Grazie.